In recent years, there has been a surge in both the West and East of parody media. Part of this stems from the explosion of the internet spreading the idea of ironic enjoyment of otherwise low-quality material, and the parody seeks to easily capitalize on this by creating a work which taps into the qualities that engendered these feelings of ironic appreciation, while itself having a higher-than-average bar of quality to its name. But far more potently, the parody has gained wider acclaim as of late due to the internet helming the information age. In our modern society, we can be exposed to more accessible information in a single day than entire cultures of the past were able to amass over the course of centuries. This paradigm has produced a situation in which the more observant of us can immediately recognize storytelling tropes in books, common shot composition techniques in film, the defining traits of sakuga in animation, or telling signs of inspired mechanics in games. And upon seeing these commonalities just once, we are thusly incapable of ignoring their presence in every other instance in which they appear, many times highlighted by the analysis YouTuber. And invariably, unless one is analytically minded and therefore derives enjoyment from the breakdown of a work's usage of particular elements of construction, this leads to unfortunate boredom. Nothing feels unique or special. Everything is just a reskin of the same ideas, and the cry goes out for something, anything, which is different. But creating something wholly unique in all aspects is damn near impossible, as Joseph Campbell would attest, and we arrive in a place where the next best solution is the parody. A parody is defined by Webster's dictionary as a literary or musical work in which the style of an author or work is closely imitated for comic effect or ridicule. I feel this is an accurate representation, but would add that a parody of the modern variety also heavily banks on a sense of self-awareness. The modern parody doesn't just use a recognizable style simply to make fun of it. It uses that style in complete and commentative self-awareness of its oversaturation. Parody, as it stands now, seeks to blossom a feeling of cathartic relief in its audience by affirming to them that, no, they aren't the only ones who recognize that a formula has become bloated, rote, and boring. It attempts to incite feelings of being a breath of fresh air despite relying heavily on the very tried and true methodologies it mocks to be successful. But a deconstruction, a term often incorrectly conflated and interchanged with parody, is markedly distinct, though it too has been spawned from the same modern sentiments as parody. For the sake of consistency, Webster defines a deconstruction thusly: the analytical examination of something often in order to reveal its inadequacy. Far more so than the definition of parody, I find this explanation inadequate. Where a parody seeks to poke fun at commonality in media whilst still depending on that commonality for success and recognition, a deconstruction bears resemblance to other similar material only as a point of affectation. A deconstruction is more purposeful as a mode of critique, however contained within a narrative it is, and therefore reflects current trends only in so much as is required to make it clear which elements are being criticized. A deconstruction is far more startling, abrupt, and rude in its approach. It seeks to twist and deform tropes and techniques as a metatextual commentary on their overuse, relying on this analysis and the stark contrast to generate its appeal. So understanding these two approaches to self-aware media, I was beset with the question of which best described Digibro's new light novel project. Trapped in my own shitty light novel after killing myself, might as well court the goddess. And through this video, we'll explore my reasonings which brought me to my conclusion that it is, unequivocally, a deconstruction. Right out of the gate in this first volume, we are given 3 traits which completely turn the isekai genre on its head and reflect the distaste of Digi, and that of his brand of otaku, for the isekai trend. The most immediately apparent, and one which inundates the entire volume and likely entire project, is the heavy and prolific use of expletives. Now, there is some concession to be made that Japanese is a language without the wide field of swears we possess in English, thusly keeping a true Japanese light novel from overflowing with them, but the effect is nonetheless unchanged. Digi using these words is not, as is so often the case with independent, and particularly of the fan variety, fiction, an attempt to generate a flimsy sense of maturity in the work. It is instead a direct antithesis to the entire purpose of the vast majority of isekai stories. Isekai as a genre of narrative rides success off the back of power-tripping fantasy. The idea that any shut-in neat hikikomori could be powerful and respected if only the world around them was built with a framework that valued their particular skills and knowledge. While the isekai story is certainly escapist to the nth degree, it is more foundationally based on hope. Hope for a better life without breaking an individual's identity. However, in flooding the manuscript with incessant, casual curses, Digi has immediately grounded this story in bold, unrelenting reality. By extension, this colors the characters with a sharp dose of cynicism as people who have long ago abandoned the fleeting idea of hope. This far more accurately represents the mindsets of people who typically indulge in isekai stories, and in so doing, throws into sharp relief how truly pathetic and pitiful such an existence truly is, and criticizes the willful denial of such an existence by its participants in attempting to shoulder all their hang-ups on a fantasy character who is similar to them in hobbyist proclivities only. The second immediate indicator of Digi's work as a deconstruction grows from the perpetual tone, which, while less intense in the middle, so cleanly bookends the volume that it cannot be considered anything but a thematic through line. That through line, of course, being existential dread. The volume's opening is filled to bursting with Takuma's sentiments of worthlessness, powerlessness, broken acceptance, hopelessness, and self-destructive thoughts. He is the picture of passion burned down to less than ashes by unforgiving reality. A man chained on one side to his inescapable desire to create, but on the other to the relentless demands of a market caring little for true ingenuity and creativity. It has worn him down to a cynical, sarcastic, dull, and utterly shattered shell of a man with little to live for outside instinctual self-preservation. The existential dread in it comes both from how Digi does not shy away from the depiction of this type of man, no matter how despondent it appears, and in how Takuma is written to be aware of his broken nature, but to have such an advanced degree that he lacks the energy to even rage against his situation. Takuma as a protagonist is so devoid of hope that while he becomes orders of magnitude more emblematic of the people whom the isekai narrative is meant to appeal, he is also frightening in how accurate his depiction of despondence truly is. Lastly, trapped in my own shitty light novel after killing myself, might as well court the goddess, completely deconstructs the inciting incident of so many isekai in the method through which Takuma is sent to his alternate fantasy reality. Digi cheekily reminds us that all of these kinds of protagonists are always killed after being hit by near-identical trucks, but the fact that Takuma dies in this fashion is, as deconstructions do, merely adherence to the tangible affectations to ensure attention is paid to the more important circumstances surrounding the event rather than the event itself. By using such a mimetic point of commonality with these stories and further drawing attention to it through near-overt statement, that this is the technique used is perceived as commonplace and uninspired, enticing the reader to begin looking for where the meaning is actually derived. This is, of course, pulled from the fact that Takuma's death is not accidental, nor inherently amusing, we'll cover Digi's use of comedy shortly, but is instead a suicide wrapped in a rather dark, twisted framework. In the typical isekai, the protagonist usually possesses no genre savviness toward the existence of isekai stories, which, while unrealistic in its own right, enables him to experience a feeling of freshness and relief upon being given the chance to course-correct his life in a fantasy setting. And should the isekai in question actually allow the protagonist to understand the implications of isekai structures, his revelation upon having this event happen to him is one of jubilance and excitement for the same reasons as his compatriot without the aforementioned savvy. But Takuma? His death is intentional. He craves death. Release from this torturous mortal coil he has found is filled with nothing but existential dread and emotional emptiness. He straight up monologues in his head just before jumping in front of the truck that will kill him that he is genuinely grateful that there is no such thing as an isekai in reality, that his life will be snuffed out and he will at last be at peace. This is such a stark contrast to characters of Takuma's ilk and makes it one of the heralds of Digi's light novel being a deconstruction. With Takuma committing suicide, and gratefully so at that, Digi has blown wide open the reality of the men upon which Takuma and other isekai protagonists are based. It endeavors to crack into the broken mentality of an individual so completely at a loss for their reason to live that they would rejoice at the prospect of being reborn within a new paradigm. And upon so doing, recognizes that anyone able to openly invite death upon themselves as a positive would be highly unlikely to bear goodwill to the idea that they would be born anew, usually with what amounts to far greater responsibilities and expectations upon their shoulders than the world they left. It is from this recognition of utter despondence these characters ought to exhibit that we receive Takuma's own revelation of having been isekai'd. He is not joyful, he is not hopeful, and he is certainly not excited about the new prospects which may yet await him. The mental drain of a seemingly meaningless existence does not magically whisk away upon equally fantastical forces bending the laws of causality for the sake of a wish fulfillment narrative. Takuma is still depressed, unfocused, exhausted, and cynical upon arriving in this new world. By creating this through line of characterization consistency, Digi produces a dichotomy between his story and the slew of other isekai. In Takuma simply remaining true to his established self prior to death, Digi calls into question why exactly isekai characters are considered relatable at all, as they go through no arc which relieves them of those identities which made them prime audience inserts to begin with. Subsequently, Takuma, as a deconstruction, in actually possessing a consistent character through the seminal isekai moment, utterly demolishes the idea that any isekai protagonist is actually a character at all. This then brings us to Takuma's encounter with the incredulously described Dragon Quest slime, and his declaration of purpose to Aether. The first of these is a focus on comedy and provides an excellent means by which to examine Digi's use of it in this first volume. Put simply, the comedy of Digi's light novel is dry, unapologetic, narcissistic sarcasm. This suits Digi as an author, of course, but also plays a key role in differentiating the volume from other works which are more clearly parodies, such as Konosuba. The entire tone of trapped in my own shitty light novel after killing myself, might as well court the goddess, is one of incredulity, impatient disbelief on such a level as to induce bafflement. In a parody, the comedy is generated by the work fully embracing and accepting the established tropes and tangible affectations of the source style, and merely taking them to their natural end point. It endeavors to highlight the underlying hilarity of commonalities by taking them to the logical extreme. At this point, I'm sure you can recognize where I'm going with this. Digi's comedy is not vested in exploration of isekai trappings through inflated exaggerations. Most of the tropes are played as straight as Robin Hood's arrows right up until the point where they are warped to create a retroactive introspection on what the original actually espouses and whether it does or doesn't fail. The comedy of Digi's light novel, then, as an extension of deconstructive criticism, is used in such a way as to comment on the numerous ways in which many isekai stories waste the audience's time with meaningless drivel. In transforming these moments into comedic skits, not only does Digi retain audience engagement out of the scene itself being hilarious, he also highlights how deplorably boring these same types of scenes are in the standard isekai, as they are themselves often devoid of comedic intent. Rather than praise the tropes of the isekai genre as a parody inherently does, Digi's deconstructive novel builds a sense of internalized resentment for the very ideas his narrative is making light of, and asks the reader to consider why exactly they find these tropes at all interesting. Then, of course, we have Takuma's declaration to Aether of his intent to make her fall in love with him as his own personal goal to drive him to live in this new reality. Now, on the one hand, this scene acts mostly as a contained unit in which Digi can allow himself to espouse his own personal views on the nature of the human condition. All authors do this to some extent, and the only reason I recognize it here is simply because I've been following all of Digi's content since way back in the Pony days, circa 2012, and have heard more than one version of the ethos Takuma monologues on straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. And it is not a negative for this to be included in the slightest. In fact, it highlights a major problem with many isekai light novels. That being that they tend to lack any firm, authorially unique perspective, which they profess either blatantly as Digi does or otherwise. There is no desire present in their subtext to explore any personally informed understanding of humanity as more than flesh and blood. This is what we call theming, and Digi's inclusion of it here so boldly and borderline condescendingly puts into sharp relief how often an isekai narrative seems to exist for no other reason than the fact that isekai narratives sell, like red bean paste buns. They have no greater commentary on the nature of man, and therefore lack any impetus for audience investment, driving them into a state where they are forgotten as soon as they are removed from store shelves, in a vicious cycle of publishers seeking more and more variants of the isekai story to keep up with demand from an audience which, whether consciously or not, desires something with more meat on its bones which actually speaks to them on a more fundamental level. But even more than that, Takuma declaring his purpose to be to woo Aether is also set up for our next topic of discussion. Fucking. Anyone who knows Digibro could not go into an isekai of his own creation expecting him to avoid the inclusion of flagrant sexual activity and discussion. And true to form, the next character of import, Exia, is introduced as even more of a sexual object and sexually driven character than even Aether was, followed soon thereafter by assured confirmation of actual sex between her and Takuma, with an admittedly amusing tangent from Digi about the invention of magical contraception and a sexually open medieval culture. The Digibro fans and patrons will know that Digi has a long history of commentative and combative discussion over anime sidelining romantic couples and sexual activity to a place of irrelevance or genuine stupidity, so it's no shock that he would go out of his way to include this adjustment of the typical anime narrative styling to satiate his own proclivities. That is part and parcel the point of writing your own fiction in many cases. But it's not as though Digi includes overt sexuality merely for his own personal satisfaction. This is instead, as much of the volume is, commentary on the subject as criticism of it in standard isekai fare. In the book, Takuma is almost overwhelmed by the sexual prowess afforded him by his position as isekai protagonist, and beset by a strange form of guilt for indulging in it so heavily. His internal conflict over having definitively fallen in love with Exia despite his earlier declaration to woo Aether creates a battle of emotional conflict within him that he cannot find an answer for, and for which his only solution is to weakly consider his relationships with any of the women he sleeps with to be temporary at best. And it notably hurts him. On the one hand, this kind of deep dive into the emotional complexities of physical affection through sex casts shade over other isekai and how they surround their protagonists with beautiful women, only for him to half-heartedly never engage with any of them on any meaningful, devoted level. Through this, we are able to see how unrealistic such a situation is, and further emphasizes how lacking in depth any isekai protagonist is by comparison to Takuma. More meaningfully, though, Takuma's internal struggles over his own insensitivity to the emotional bonds formed through sexual experience shed light on the damning nature of isekai narratives with regard to their treatment of romance, or as the case most often is, lack thereof. See, of course it is frustrating to many of us, especially myself as a fan of romance shows, for the question of love to be dodged around by almost every isekai, even though we understand perfectly why it is done. As already established, Digi has placed Takuma in a position to show how much of a non-character most isekai protagonists are for the purpose of allowing self-insertion of the target audience. Following that, it also makes logical sense that in order to preserve such shallow investment, these stories not allow the protagonists to canonically get together with any of the wide array of women such that the adherent demographic is allowed to co-opt feelings of romance with any of the girls they find more personally appealing. Takuma's guilt here is a direct whiplashing of that approach. Through this much more genuine, realistic view of the effect of non-committal sexual activity despite clear desires to the contrary, Digi allows Takuma to crush his contemporaries. For even if they hold their harem of women at a sexual arm's length, that they are never shown to feel a sense of remorse for this emotional distance to those who clearly care about them deeply and to whom they reciprocate those feelings, asks the question of how they can even be fit at all for romantic interest. This thusly translates into those who would insert themselves in place of the protagonist, Digi's Takuma forcing one to consider whether their shallow desire for love and sex is something they themselves deserve, the very idea Takuma himself struggles with despite his sexual authority in this world. So now we come to the ending, because much of the rest of the book is largely filled with what amounts to little more than setup for its eventual continuation. Setup which will likely not have its full potential and meaning revealed until it is capitalized on later on down the line. And speaking of setup, we must needs talk about how exactly the ending of the volume is built with a scene that, prior to the ending, feels like the weakest part of the book: Takuma's duel with Cassius. For those who have read the volume, which I highly recommend if you haven't, I think we can all agree that the fight was rather groan-worthy without the context which would come later. It is so flagrantly power-tripping fantasy garbage that it felt as though it was the first attempt by 15-year-old me at creating fiction. Its only purpose, at first glance, is to demonstrate just exactly how badass Takuma is and how little he cares about the consequences of his actions. Except, upon closer examination, this doesn't appear to make much sense. Takuma is repeatedly shown to have made a resonant connection with the town and its people, and carries the weight of leaving it behind like a true, unironic burden. And he even comments post-Cassius abuse that the entire ordeal felt awkward and stupid for him. This is, of course, meant to highlight these exact traits in what these scenes feel like in other isekai, especially wherein the protagonist doesn't feel any regret for his actions despite a contradictory passion for the new world and people around him. The real impact of this scene, though, is in Takuma's confrontation with Akita, though it is not, even by a long shot, the most compelling part of Digi's villain. As Takuma is first met with Akita, there isn't even a fight, as the villain immediately stops Takuma in his tracks with the very same power Takuma himself used to embarrass and disgrace the drunkenly innocent Cassius. All at once, the enormity of his own insensitivity in that encounter washes over Takuma as he is forced to confront how evil and uncaring he must have seemed to the very people he had grown to feel a fondness toward. This is a massive flex on the power fantasy most isekai indulge in. It calls into question the ethics of desiring such power and throws into sharp relief the responsibility and maturity inherently necessary to wield it properly. Furthermore, it highlights how irredeemably uncouth and soulless many other isekai protagonists tend to be in service of the power fantasy, and how there is never presented any challenge which questions the morality of so blindly and uncaringly meting out a brand of so-called justice, which ignores the nuance required of such a position of authority. Digi here creates a situation which forces both us and Takuma to consider that the desire for power is oftentimes selfish, misplaced, and dangerously narcissistic, and that to use that power to those ends is many times more villainous than the actions of the so-described characters isekai protagonists fight against. But perhaps the most compelling component of trapped in my own shitty light novel after killing myself might as well court the goddess, and the part which drove me to do this analysis, is the origin and motivation behind Akita himself, and how it further deconstructs the idea of being isekai as something desirable. Akita was born into this isekai world from having died when the truck which Takuma used to commit suicide veered into his car, killing him and the unborn child and his pregnant wife. All of his hard work, ambition, love, and future was snatched away from him in a freak accident caused by a selfish, unrepentant, and weak Takuma. His reason for revival? To destroy Takuma at the behest of the Lovecraftian horror Takuma is apparently destined to himself defeat. Akita is revived to mete out vengeful justice on Takuma for having caused the death of not one, but 2 innocent lives. This knowledge emotionally devastates Takuma, as it rightly should. But more than this, it is Digi proclaiming the shallow nature of the desire of the isekai demographic to experience the very transcendent revival of the stories they gravitate to. Akita describes his life as being damn near perfect before Takuma inadvertently ended it. He had busted his ass in school, climbed the ladder for a well-paying and satisfying job, fallen in love with and married a beautiful and equally successful woman, and had earned success enough to not only own nice luxuries, but to confidently start a family. He fought tooth and nail through the difficulties of life and came out the other side better for it, only for someone without the wherewithal to see life through to abruptly end it. The dichotomy between Takuma and Akita's righteous fury and desire for revenge, and Takuma's gut-wrenching sense of devastation and disgust with himself, deconstruct in one massive hammer blow the entire appeal of isekai. Akita represents grit and the willingness to push through when the going is rough, always striving for what is waiting in the wings for those that stick it out. In him, Digi has ripped into the idea of escapism as a source of enjoyment in media, demonstrating that lack of success is not a matter of the world being against you, but of you actively working against yourself. Trapped in my own shitty light novel after killing myself might as well court the goddess, seeks to drive home the theme of learning to recognize that no matter how hopeless, how despondent life may be, it is never worth seeking to escape from it, bordering on outright condemning the idea of suicide as an escape. Because Takuma doesn't escape. He is forced through being isekai to confront his insecurities and imperfections of character, to actually grow the fuck up and face the challenges of life head on rather than run away. It is for these things that Digi's novel is a fantastic deconstruction, but more than that, a fantastic story in and of itself. Catch you on the flip side, Digibro.